The situation in Ukraine and what Russia has just announced is bound to dominate discussions taking place in the United Nations General Assembly over in New York. The Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky is set to address the assembly later in a video link from Ukraine. So what will this partial Russian mobilization mean for the war on the ground and the West's reaction that will doubtless follow? Let's get more reaction from the Conservative MP Bob Cilley. He is a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and has just returned from Kyiv. Great to have you on the programme. Partial mobilization, Putin says. They've suffered heavy losses in Ukraine, as have Kyiv's forces. By all accounts, Moscow is struggling to get new recruits for its military operation. What do you think this partial mobilization will mean on the ground?
It's difficult to say. Well, firstly, good morning to your listeners. It's difficult to say what it's going to mean on the ground because it depends how successful it is, how much training, and how well these new soldiers are incorporated into the battalion groups that the Russians have. So if it's done professionally and well, and if they're given basic training, it could make a difference. If this is a desperate move just to shove live bodies into units and battalions that are under strength and under motivated and have had significant losses, then it is difficult to see how this will make a critical difference against highly motivated and increasingly well-trained and well-equipped Ukrainian forces that are in the ascendancy. There are wider issues here. President Putin has been building up to this partial mobilization over really a period of years, and we've seen at least a decade, if not nearly 2 decades, of increasing anti-Western rhetoric in Russia. So this is a dangerous but progression on what has gone before.
As you say, Putin is blaming the West for this extended war in Ukraine. If he escalates, what next from the West?
Well, it's very difficult. I think what will happen is what has been happening at the moment is that the West will continue to arm the Ukrainian state because the Ukrainians have the right to self-determination. Ukraine is a state recognized by all countries in the world, including the Russian Federation. It has a right to defend its borders. It has a right to buy arms or to be supplied with them. And it has a right to defend its nation state and its territorial integrity and the Ukrainian nation. So we will continue to do what we are doing. I very strongly would recommend that we continue to have a dialogue with the Russians. Dialogue is not appeasement. Even at the height of the Cold War, when they were the clear adversary, we continue to have a discussion. We continue to talk with these people. And we need to continue to do that, if only to understand the sort of fevered mentality and the sort of paranoia that exists in the Kremlin and amongst the Russian security elite. When Putin talks about the West wanting to destroy Russia, he's effectively, and he said so in his speech, he's going back to a trope about the KGB and the Soviet Union at the time and the leaders then. There was a sort of paranoid conspiracy theories about how the West had destroyed the Soviet Union. And clearly he is showing that mindset now, which is clearly a very disturbing thing, but it is part of a longer term sort of embitterment by the KGB, by the Red Army, or by forces within them that blames the West for Russia's problems.
And this paranoia is obviously causing total Russophobia. He's enforcing the West's supposed hatred for Russia. Do you think the Russian public will buy that line from Putin 7 months into this conflict?
I think some will, some won't. But again, over the last 10, 15 years, what Putin has tried to do is create an apolitical, apathetic political society when it comes to politics. So I think most people will simply try to shut out what is happening. Some will oppose, but relatively small numbers perhaps. I think many will be worried about what's happening in their country, and some will support it, including a small but vociferous class of hard right, hard nationalist commentators who think that Russia should be upping the ante in Ukraine, who thinks that this is a war against the West and Ukraine is the battlefield, that is, calling, as we've seen very disturbingly, for destruction of civilian infrastructure, which is a war crime, and for the use of ever more dramatic weapons in order defeat the Ukrainians in the field of battle, which they seem to be unable to do. Putin will try to break the link between between the West and Ukraine. That is now the Ukrainians' weak point. Putin can't, it seems to be very difficult, if not impossible, for Putin to win on the battlefield. He will try to find a victory by scaring away the West and preventing the West supplying arms to Ukraine. So the Ukrainians are starved of weapons on the battlefield, and he will then move to destroy their civilian infrastructure to try to break Ukrainian morale over the winter.
And very briefly, do you think Kyiv can win out here over the long run?
Militarily, if it was simply a case of Russia versus Ukraine and Ukrainians could get the necessary supplies, I think they could win. Yes, I mean, I think it'll take several more months, and one successful counteroffensive is not the end of the war. So there is a long way to go, but potentially I think yes, because in terms of morale, in terms of training, in terms of the structure of the Ukrainian armed forces, I think they are now qualitatively and quantitatively better than the Russians. There are, however, many other factors to take into account. You know, Russia's energy supply, if Russia can break the link, as I was saying, between the Western allies and Ukraine. So there are many more facets of this war which Putin will try to manipulate in order to gain a victory that thus far he's been unable to get on the battlefield.
Bob Seely, Conservative MP, thank you for joining us on Newsday.